Hey guys, welcome back to Final Fantasy 15. Let's read Dawn of the Future 4.5. Because I had some technical difficulties on my end. OBS was being a prick, and I was actually able to shut it down without shutting down my whole stream. Or fix it without shutting down my whole stream. Which happens every once in a while. It's a fucking miracle. So Soul is weirded out by the fight with the Death Gaze, and how Luna had been able to heal herself immediately, and she doesn't know what the fuck's going on, but she appreciates Luna helping out, but she's wary. Okay. On the outside, Soul was doing her best to keep a straight face. How about a bit of a break? She asked the woman. Yes, please, came the voice, thick with exhaustion. They stopped, each leaning against the bike, then sliding down to sit on the ground. Soul was careful to keep her arm positioned for a quick draw if needed. This was the second time they'd stopped to rest. Soul glanced once more at the bike. The Death Gaze had managed to mangle it pretty bad. No amount of roadside tinkering was going to get it moving like this. They needed access to spare parts, as well as the space and time to make the repairs. Pushing it to the nearest temporary outpost was the only choice they had. Not that it was a bad choice. It was the right thing to do, and part of what the outposts were set up for in the first place. Aside from functioning as bases from which to conduct reconnaissance and strikes against the demons, they were dotted throughout the former Imperial territories as makeshift shelters for anyone who found themselves in unexpected circumstances. She told the so-called Oracle that Whale Outpost was just a stone's throw away. In reality, that was mostly to keep the woman from getting any funny ideas. It seemed reasonable enough to think she'd go along with things quietly if she believed Soul's comrades weren't too far away. When they'd had a minute to catch their breaths, Lunafreya asked, Might I ask, do you often travel by yourself? Are you nuts? Of course not. It just worked out that way today. It wasn't a lie. Traipsing around demon-infested territory on your own was gambling with your life. That kind of thing only a mad fool would do. Yeah, Soul thought. It just worked out that way. More precisely, she'd had an unfortunate run-in with a pack of demons. She'd taken the things on, and, in the process, ranged a little farther out than she intended. When she realized what had happened, she was pretty far separated from her squad. Naturally, she'd immediately headed to the rendezvous point. It would have been fine if she hadn't been sidelined by an oracle and a death gaze along the way. Anyway, the important thing now was getting to the nearest outpost. Fixing the bike was the next priority, even if it meant heading in the opposite direction of the rendezvous. It seems strange that there isn't any other traffic along here, Lunafreya ventured. When they'd had their first break and Soul had stopped the bike right in the middle of the road and sat down, the Oracle had asked, Shouldn't we at least push it to the shoulder? She'd said it with a completely straight face, too. That had been the first clue that she wasn't full of it. Maybe she really had been living under a rock for the past 10 years. Didn't you hear me the last time? Soul responded. It's empty out here. Lestalem's the only town we have left. Soul had explained that because of the demons, the world was in a state of perpetual night. The corners of the Oracle's mouth tightened at the news. And when Soul had told her how demons ran wild in Insomnia, that it was more or less a nest for the things, the woman's face visibly paled. To top it off, Soul mentioned a rumor she'd heard, that the king had been pulled inside the crystal itself. At that, the Oracle began to tremble, as if she might faint altogether. So, she continued in the present, as if explaining to a child, if there aren't any people, there aren't any cars. Admittedly, there was some traffic in the areas outside of Lestalem. Trucks still had to haul merits from one location to another, and hunters hit the road for recon missions or to take out particular packs of demons that needed quelling. But that didn't amount to a large number of vehicles, and the farther out you went, the fewer there were. The former expanse of the Empire wasn't exactly on the doorstep of modern civilization. So the idea of a car cruising down the highway, blaring its horn at a couple of travelers sitting out in the middle of the road, was a scene that could have been straight out of a fairy tale. Soul turned to look at her companion. Assuming you're the real Oracle and everything you've said is true, that you did actually die 10 years ago and come back to life. Speaking of fairy tales, she thought. It still doesn't add up. We're talking 10 whole years. You had to be doing something during that whole time. Lunafreya remained silent, crestfallen. Soul sighed. This was the real world, not a fairyland. Whatever, Soul said. Break time's over. Let's get some more effort out of those arms, Lady Oracle. The stranger stood up, looking determined once more. It seemed like her spirit might match her unanticipated physical strength. Clearly, there was more to this woman than met the eye. Not much further to wail, Sol announced. This time, it wasn't a lie. I should have done this while I just need to very quickly pop that up. No, not add. I just very need to quickly pop that up there. Okay. I just needed to change the pictures a bit so I can just swap between Luna and Sol really quick. Ready, steady, push. Right around the time they developed a nice rhythm and the motorcycle was rolling along at a steady clip, Lunafreya saw a stretch of road ahead lined by several wooden structures. Sol nodded her head towards it. So this was the temporary outpost she'd spoken of. Whale. They'd made it. According to Sol, nobody lived out here in the remnants of Niflheim, in the remnants of the Niflheim Empire. But the hunters in Kingsglaive were still active. It seemed that they came out this way for reconnaissance or to conduct surveys of the land and of demons. Whale was one foothold from which they would carry out those duties. When they drew close to the buildings, Lunafreya could see that everything was old and worn, all except the doors and their locks. The outpost seemed to consist solely of repurposed structures. These buildings might have been abandoned residences that the hunters and others had salvaged for their own needs. Lunafreya breathed a sigh of relief at the thought that their long walk was over. Sol had lent her a pair of boots when they began pushing. She was grateful to have them, but the fit wasn't quite right, and the way the leather chafed against her bare skin made it difficult to walk. She'd been determined to do her part in pushing the motorcycle, but in truth, her feet were sore and she was exhausted. Speaking of Luna, I should hop back to Luna. They parked the motorcycle, and Sol produced a keycard to open the door to one of the buildings. From her confident movements, Lunafreya perceived it wasn't the first time she'd been to this particular outpost. "Hey! Anyone here?" Sol shouted. Then after a pause, "Guess not." Sol flicked on the lights and gave a small shrug. None of the windows had been illuminated as they rolled in. Apparently, Sol was right. No one else was here. From the way Sol had spoken, Lunafreya assumed the young woman's companions would be waiting for her at the outpost. Perhaps it was simply her way of making Lunafreya feel a bit less forlorn, just like how she'd continually described the distance to Whale as a stone's throw away, when most of the trek it had been anything but. "Hello? Cindy?" Sol stood with the small device in hand. "Finally, it's about time you picked up." The device was thin, flat, and rectangular. It must have been some kind of transceiver. And whoever Cindy was, Sol seemed ecstatic to be talking to her. In fact, she realized, Sol had been trying to reach this person for some time. Before they'd started pushing the motorcycle, and again during each of their breaks, she had fiddled with the same transceiver, apparently trying to get through to this Cindy. Each time the transmission failed to go through, Sol had made a sour face and muttered, "Why isn't she picking up?" Then she put the transceiver away with a sigh. So, Luna doesn't know what cell phones are. Because we know in the final chapter that Talcott uses a phone. So, the phone towers are still up. So, Luna doesn't know what a cell phone is. Oh my goodness. Unless in Comrades, like, there is an actual point where they need transceivers, but I'm like near positive Talcott had a phone on him. Oh, that's true. Yeah, he did. Okay, thank you, Mata. I thought I was like, am I going fucking crazy? The Empire wouldn't want her to have one. That's true. My mod just pointed that out. Yeah, because then she could call Noct. Yeah. Okay, thank you, mod. Whatever the case, Lunafreya could guess at a few things. Cindy was versed in whatever knowledge they need to require to get the motorcycle running, and Sol desperately needed Cindy's help. "Yeah, that's right," Sol was saying. Wham! Right onto the pavement. And now she's not making a peep. I don't even know where to start. It seemed her assumptions had been correct. Sol moved back outside to the parked motorcycle, and Lunafreya followed at a slight distance. She'd promised to help. It didn't feel right to stay behind in the building, resting by herself. But it occurred to her that perhaps she ought to hang back a bit longer, so as not to accidentally appear to be listening in on the conversation. Just then, she heard a familiar bark. She turned around to find a black dog bounding towards her, excitedly wagging his tail. "Umbra!" Lunafreya exclaimed. She hurried over to meet the dog and immediately began running her hands through his warm, soft fur. His poofy tail swished excitedly from side to side. The sight of it made her glad, but also brought to mind of another tail, this one white. "If it's just you, then I suppose that means that Prina..." The other dog had remained beside Lunafreya until the very end in Altissia. Again and again she'd commanded Prina to flee, but the dog had stayed stubbornly by Lunafreya's side. Her absence now surely meant that she'd sunk into the sea alongside her master's wounded body. Lunafreya looked at Umbra. "I'm sorry. I wish I could take you back with me, but..." Lunafreya... Umbra just wagged his tail in response, as if to say he understood. Luna's name was right below that. "Thank you," Lunafreya murmured as she stroked his ruff. "What about Noctis?" she asked. Umbra continued to wag his tail. He gave a spirited bark. It seemed Noctis was safe. Still, Umbra wasn't carrying their notebook. "The notebook?" she asked him. "Does Noctis have it?" She desperately longed to write a message, to tell Noctis she was alive and well. She tried to think of something she could use in the notebook's place, then remembered what she'd seen in the outpost building. Stay here for me, Umbra," she said, and turned back to enter the building. There had been notebooks and scraps of paper on a table there, along with a number of mismatched pens and pencils. "I'm sorry to use this without permission," she said, not knowing the object's owner, and thus not exactly sure to whom she was apologizing. Still, she felt compelled to express her remorse aloud. She picked up a notebook slightly smaller than the one she and Noctis had used, as well as a pen. In a rushed scrawl, she wrote, "I'm safe." She would have liked to add the date, but she'd forgotten to ask Sol about the current month and year. She dashed back outside to find Umbra faithfully waiting just beside the entrance to the building. "Please," she asked the messenger, "see that Noctis gets this." Umbra had always managed to convey the notebook safely to Noctis before, no matter where he was. Even when Lunafreya had been cloistered in the training grounds, and even when she'd been hiding away in Altissia, the dog still had managed to relay their messages without trouble. So this new message would surely find its way as well. "Please hurry," she pleaded, but Umbra stayed firmly planted in place, shaking his head from side to side. "I can't," he seemed to be saying. "Why won't you go?" she asked. But Umbra only stared back in silence. Though the dog did not speak with the words of man, he was still a messenger of the gods. If he refused her plea, there must have been some reasonable explanation. "You cannot," she surmised. "But tell me, Noctis is safe, yes?" she asked again, at which point Umbra nuzzled against her. "Everything will be okay," he seemed to say. "Please don't worry." "Do you mean to say it is not time yet for us to reunite?" Umbra's tail began waving more vigorously than before. She gently embraced the dog's warm body. "Then I shall wait," she said. "Thank you, Umbra." Umbra gave one more wag, tail held high, and then he was gone. Lunafreya let out a small sigh. It was the first familiar face she'd seen in this new world, into which she'd been thrust so bewilderingly. Speaking of which, where was Gentiana? She felt certain Gentiana had been there at the end, right as she slipped into the slumber of death below the waves at Altissia. It would have brought so much comfort to see her again. Until Umbra's appearance, it hadn't seemed a possibility. Perhaps Gentiana, too, was aware that the Oracle had returned to life. And if Umbra could visit, surely Gentiana would be able to as well. Lunafreya thought of the many things she wished she could tell Gentiana regarding what had transpired, and of the many questions she wanted to ask. The outpost was not far from Tenebrae. Surely a visit was not out of the question. The thought sparked a new strength and determination within her. When Lunafreya turned back towards the motorcycle, Sol was still speaking with the woman named Cindy. So we got Umbra, you bumper puppers. And so, even though Luna came back, Prina did not. Prina's still gone, good girl. Sol had been ready to thank the gods when she finally got through to Cindy. I agree, poor Prina. The bike was in bad shape. She'd been worried half to death that it might be beyond repair, that it would have to be scrapped altogether. But Cindy, ever the genius mechanic, was making everything all right again. And she was doing it all over the phone to boot. Cindy had rattled off questions on how the bike was behaving, which Sol had answered as best she could. The answers must have been good enough, because Cindy almost immediately seemed to understand what was wrong and started giving instructions for how to get the bike up and running again. And the level of detail! Cindy had it all covered, right down to which parts weren't kept on hands at the outposts, and what Sol could use as substitutes for their repair. "Yeah, I think I've got it," Sol said, once she'd located everything they need. "Thanks, Cindy. You're a lifesaver." And Cindy had replied, in her usual upbeat tone, "Oh, honey, don't you worry about it." "Hey, while I've got you," Sol ventured, voice suddenly hushed, "something kind of weird happened. Wonder if I could get your opinion." Sol glanced over her shoulder. The Oracle was busy playing with some stray that had found its way to the outpost. She didn't seem to be paying the least bit of attention to the call with Cindy. "Perfect. I ran into someone. The Oracle." "Say again?" Cindy said, her voice shooting up an octave. A reasonable response, to be fair. There wasn't a soul on the star that didn't know that the Oracle died in Altisha 10 years ago. "That's who she claims to be anyway," Sol continued. "Think there's any chance she's for real?" Cindy fell silent. It took a while for her response to finally come. "Well, honestly, I don't know what to think," was all she said. That seemed like a reasonable reaction to Sol, too. She didn't know what to think either, even with the supposed Oracle standing right before her eyes. "Anyway, wonder if you could pass the word on to, Gladio and the rest of them," Sol said. "Sooner's probably better than later." She intentionally tiptoed around titles, referring to the shield by name and avoiding the word Kingsglaive, too. Cindy would know what she meant and get the word out to those in charge at Lestalem. Out of the corner of her eye, Sol noticed the Oracle looking in her direction. The dog was nowhere to be seen. It must have run off. Time to wrap things up before the woman got suspicious. "Okay then, I'll talk to you later. Thanks again, Cindy," she said, and ended the call before Cindy could reply to the request. "Hey," she turned to the stranger. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Sol casually waved the woman over, and the Oracle hurried near. "My friend Cindy gave me the rundown on how to fix up the bike. I've never had a crash this bad, so this is some kind of new to me." There was a good way and a bad way for a bike to fall. A good fall didn't leave more than a few scratches on the rider or the bike. Sol had always been a natural ever since she started riding. She'd taken some spills, but never bad enough to really mess the vehicle up. So she'd never truly had to learn how to do some serious repair work. "I truly am sorry," the Oracle said, her shoulders slumping slightly. She seemed to have taken Sol's earlier jab to heart and really did feel responsible for the accident. "Show it. Don't say it. Sit tight over there while I get things ready. Then you can give me a hand." "Certainly." The Oracle nodded with the innocence of a child. Her lack of concern probably indicated just how little she knew about bike repair. This was going to require muscle, and by the end of it, their hands would be filthy, coated in dirt and grease. Sol laughed to herself. Once the Oracle found out what the job required, she'd probably break down in tears. That's what Sol figured, anyway, but she couldn't have been further off the mark. The Oracle didn't flinch in the slightest at getting her hands dirty. She obviously didn't have much experience working on machines, but she wasn't completely useless either. Actually, Sol had to admit, she was kind of nice to have around. A quick learner, too. If you want to get a good sense of a person's character, work alongside them. A little boring, back-breaking work will show you who they really are. How long ago had she been given that advice? Not too long, Sol decided. It would have been after she was finally recognized as more or less an adult in her own right, when the two of them could start speaking on equal terms. Good advice, sure, but the person who gave it still couldn't stop treating Sol like a child. Just that morning, Sol had gotten fed up enough to shout at her. "All right, looking pretty good," Sol announced. "The rest is fine-tuning. You leave that up to me." Sol looked up. It was night already. It had been years since you could find the sun to track the time, but the color of the sky still got a bit darker as night set in. "Let's call it a day," she said. More than anything else, she wanted some dinner. Sol yelled at Aranea. I didn't realize that was Aranea speaking, or I would have done my Aranea tone. Sol yelled at her mom. "Sol, you behave." So it seems more like Sol was, I guess, 16 at the end of Arenea's chapter. I guess 16 or 17, maybe. Not sure. They don't really. They gave us the year, but I don't quite remember. Or if they did, then Sol is still very youthful. And just got in a fight with Aranea earlier that year. She'd given Aranea the slip earlier that year. Lunafreya had thought she was accustomed to traveling. Her calling as the Oracle had taken her to all places across the land, conducting every imaginable ritual and rite, blessing the havens, easing the pain of the ill and wounded. The work had been unquestionably demanding. However, as the Oracle, she'd always traveled in the company of others. Her safety on the road was assured, and wherever she stopped, warm meals and comfortable accommodations always awaited her. She hadn't had to face demons in battle herself, nor had she ever slept in an unoccupied building, wrapped up in a dusty blanket. These experiences were new. It was also the first time she'd eaten straight from a can, fork thrust directly into the unheated and decidedly unusual contents. According to the label, she'd dined on vegetable and meat stew, but the taste was rather removed from that description. It wasn't that it was bad, but it gave her pause. The bewilderment accompanying her first bite must have been apparent, for Sol smirked and said, "Is it not to the Lady Oracle's liking?" Sol's guns were never far. She no longer watched Lunafreya with obvious, constant caution, but neither had she fostered any degree of trust. That, too, was a new experience. Never in Lunafreya's life had she been treated with such clear suspicion. The title of Oracle alone had always elicited a measure of trust and openness from anyone she encountered. Even in the Imperial forces, who regarded her with little warmth, they had never been openly disrespectful, and Lunafreya had never felt the need to go out of her way to dispel a sense of mistrust from those in the employ of the Empire. Thus, when confronted with suspicion, she had no idea how to react. She did not know the proper overtures to overcome Sol's mistrust. Lunafreya had never envisioned a need for such skills or knowledge. As she prepared for bed, her mind was still weighed down with concern. It felt as though she might not manage even a moment's sleep. But when her head met the pillow, she realized how weary her body was from the day's events, and the moment her eyes closed, she drifted off. Lunafreya Nox Fleuret. Lunafreya's eyes opened at the sound of her name. The voice was one hard to imagine coming from a human, and her surroundings were far too luminous for the mortal realm. Even a decade ago, before the perpetual darkness, there had been no place on Eos so bright. And it wasn't just the light. She hung, weightless, in a space of emptiness extending as far as the eye could see, and the emptiness itself glowed like some great jewel. This was most assuredly no part of the reality she knew. This was a place of dreams, or visions. Hearken unto the voice of the Blade Keeper, Bahamut. I'm sorry I don't have a voice synthesizer where I could make the Bahamut voice, but The Blade Keeper? As a child, she had often listened to Gentiana recounting tales of the star. They were the stories of the Hexathian, the gods of Eos, of which Bahamut was one. As Gentiana told it, all members of the six were gods to mortals, but even among them Bahamut stood apart. Titan, the Archean, Ifrit, the Infernian, Rama, the Fulgarian, Leviathan, the Hydrian, and Shiva, the Glacian. These five ruled over the natural elements of their world, existing alongside the star itself. But the Draconian was different. He existed alongside the heavens encircling the star. Gentiana never outright stated as much, but her tone seemed to suggest that Bahamut occupied a position superior to the rest. And now here Lunafreya was, being directly addressed by the Blade Keeper. A new calling awaits the Oracle. As the voice boomed, the space around Lunafreya began to shift. What had been empty void before was now darkened landscape. Within that landscape she observed the citadel. In a courtyard which she faintly remembered, Noctis and Arden stood with blades crossed. Noctis seemed much older than that day they parted in Altissia. Did that mean she was seeing a vision of the future? The scene was silent, but she could still almost hear the ringing of the two men's weapons striking against each other. At the time the swords spit sparks. At times they found their marks, and their blades and the arcs they drew were painted with blood. For a moment she thought the two men might go on fighting forever. When it finally did come to an end, this sword fight that was a duel to the death, the one on the ground was Arden. But the battle between him and Noctis was not yet over. Darkness still hung thick over Insomnia. "This cannot be," Lunafreya murmured. The scenes that came next defied everything she believed true of their lives and fates. Deep within the citadel, Noctis sat upon the throne as the true king, calling forth the power of the rings of the Lucii, summoning the souls of his ancestors. 13 kings of yore encircled Noctis, weapons held raised and ready. Each in turn thrust spectral steel into Noctis's flesh. Tears formed in Lunafreya's eyes as she watched. "Noctis!" she screamed. "Why?" No words accompanied the scene that unfolded, but nonetheless, Lunafreya found herself provided with an answer. The ring served not only to call forth the souls of the departed into the mortal realm, it also allowed its wielder to travel together with those souls, to cross over into the beyond, the realm linked to their world by way of the crystal, which had existed since time immemorial. And over its boundary could traverse no mortal flesh. Lunafreya watched as Noctis, stripped of flesh and no longer of this world, traveled to the beyond using the power of the ring. There he sought out Arden's trapped soul and destroyed it. However, use of the ring had always come at a price. The powers it bestowed cost the wielder's life. After defeating Arden, Noctis's own form shattered. He vanished in that space beyond and was gone forevermore. This was the calling of the true king, to bring an end to the bearer of darkness through sacrifice of his own existence. But that is... Lunafreya could not finish. She'd been asked by King Regis to see the Ring of the Lucii safely to his son. Keeping that promise, she believed, would ensure a future for their star, so she'd run desperately to escape insomnia as the city went up in flames. She slipped in among the throngs of evacuees and quietly made her way towards Altissia. Never had she imagined that the object for which she'd risked so much would ultimately take her beloved's life. She had sacrificed her life only for the man she loved to lose his as well. That, it seemed, had been the Oracle's calling. All her strength left her body, and she collapsed to her knees. If only she'd known. If only she'd realized the truth of her actions and the end they would bring. Thus was ordained the fate of man. Thus was the chosen meant to fulfill his calling. Lunafreya's head snapped up. Was? Had something changed? The Noctis of her vision was not as she'd known him in life. He was older, more wearied. If the Noctis she'd seen fighting with Arden was some vision of a future meant to be, perhaps the Blade Keeper's words implied that fate's course had changed. Noctis would no longer be able to fulfill his intended calling. But if that were true, what had happened to stand in his way? The color of the space around her shifted yet again. Darkness became the flames of raging fire. Arden stood, and before him, Ifrit the Infernian knelt in subjugation. The Chancellor's body was no longer that of a man. His skin was jet black, his entire form shrouded in the dark miasma of the demons. The impudent accursed would resist his fate. Eyes blind to will divine, he submits to the base desires of his iniquitous heart. The impure power the usurper wields grows great, such that even the power of the ring suffices not to drive him away. The Arden who had crossed swords with Noctis in the Citadel courtyard had seemed yet human. The Arden she saw before her now, commanding the pyre burner, was anything but. So this was the power of darkness brought to a peak. Go forth with haste to insomnia, and stay the usurper. For this purpose are new life and strength granted. Such is the Oracle's new calling. Lunafreya put a hand once more to the scar on her side. This body, dead once at Arden's hands, and this power, strong enough to stay the mightiest demons, they were both gifts bestowed onto her by the god of war. And with them, I am to defeat Arden? Me? Am I even capable of such a feat? But if fate ordained had changed, perhaps that meant Noctis would no longer need to use the ring. He'd seemed to be in such agony when it happened. If she ventured forth as the Draconian commanded, perhaps Noctis would not have to suffer. He would not shatter into pieces in the world beyond. He would not cease to exist. If Noctis could be saved, it was worth trying to see this new calling through. So here's where I actually like the resist fate ending in episode Arden, because this is what it was actually aiming for, was that Arden was actually growing too powerful for Bahamut to contain. But since they had to tie it into canon, it made it seem like a more futile gesture. Which is why for canon I like the submit to fate, but for this I like the resist fate. So yeah, Bahamut's getting worried about Arden. It's about time Bahamut worried about something. When Lunafreya awoke in the morning, the sensation wasn't any different from all the other times she'd woken. Only this time, there was no morning light to greet her. The world outside the windows was still immersed in perpetual darkness. She remembered with perfect clarity every word of her conversation with the Draconian. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not remember the god's form or visage. Somehow, that confirmed to her that what she'd seen had not been an ordinary dream or a product of her imagination. "A new calling," she said softly to herself. As the words left her mouth, she felt a surge of motivation to see it through. She sprang up, ready to act. On the floor next to where she'd slept, she saw a small pile of folded black cloth. When she picked it up, she discovered it to be a full set of clothing. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. Perhaps its presence suggested she was welcome to change into it? As she pondered what to do, the door opened and Sol peeked in. "You finally up?" Sol asked. "Oh, yes, good morning," Lunafreya responded. She paused, then asked, "About these clothes, you looked like you could use a change. I don't know if they'll fit, but it's better than walking around in what you've got on now." Over the course of the previous day, her soaked dress had finally managed to dry. Still, it was torn in several places and smeared with dirt. It had, in a sense, seen 10 years of use, so it was hardly surprising that it might literally be a bit worse for wear. She thanked Sol and quickly changed. Black was a color she'd never worn before. As Oracle, it was only proper for her to perform perform rites in formal white. I don't know where I got ritual from. On her journeys, too, she'd always chosen to wear white. Come to think of it, even her casual wardrobe had been filled exclusively with whites and off-whites. The new clothes, thus, seemed rather peculiar on her, once she'd changed and was looking herself over. The stretchable fabric was admittedly comfortable, and she suspected it would prove easy to move about in. Yet the clothing was still somehow hard to accept. It made her uneasy. She wondered if she might ever shake the feeling that she was wearing borrowed garb. The first words out of Sol's mouth on seeing her were, "Looks good on ya." Then she added, "A lot better than that old dress." It may have been self-serving, but she let Sol's compliment assuage her unease. Until this moment, she'd paid little attention to her apparel. It was strange and somewhat exhilarating to learn how a new outfit could bring with it an entirely different mood. Lunafreya was on a journey like nothing she'd experienced in her past, and she was making it in clothes wholly different from anything she'd worn before. But this new fate had been thrust upon her, and it stood to reason that new experiences and a new appearance would come with it. "I'm done tuning the bike. Once you've got some food in you, we're heading out," Sol said. It seemed Sol had woken up far earlier than Lunafreya. "I'm sorry. I promised to help you." "No big deal. Figured I'd get the repairs done early and skip on out of here. You know, leave you behind." Sol said it with a straight face, but if she truly intended to abandon Lunafreya, it seemed unlikely she'd have gone to the trouble of finding her a change of clothes. "Miss Sol, I wonder if I might ask a favor," Lunafreya ventured. She straightened and looked the other woman directly in the eye. "I should like to accompany you a bit longer. There is a destination I must reach." To fulfill this new calling, Lunafreya knew she would need assistance. Over the relatively short distance from the underground tomb to Whale, that truth had become all too apparent. Compared to Sol, she fell far short in so many ways. Sol had means to get around and was experienced in combat, and it wasn't only the obvious things. The previous night, Lunafreya had realized she did not know how to open cans of food for herself with a knife, let alone how to start a fire. Sol had the learned skills of a person well-traveled in lands from which civilization had vanished. She knew so many things that Lunafreya could not have ever hoped to gain in her days of warm welcome at every place to which she had journeyed. "Not that I expect you to see me all the way there," Lunafreya clarified. "I should simply like to stay with you as long as our paths are shared. Even a short while would be welcome." She would journey alongside Sol and learn as much as she could. Her travels as Oracle might have failed to teach her how to subsist her own, but it was not too late to begin learning now. "Where are we talking about?" Sol asked, her tone curt. She peered at Lunafreya with suspicion. "I need to get to Insomnia." "The Crown City? You've got to be kidding. I told you, that place may as well be a breeding ground for demons. What business could the prim and proper Lady Oracle have in a place like that?" "Please, I would ask you stop calling me that. My name is Lunafreya." Every time Sol referred to her as Lady Oracle, Lunafreya was acutely reminded of the wall that stood between them. Yesterday, she'd made no protest at the distant, cold means of address. Sol was, after all, a simple passerby with whom she'd shared no relationship. But now, things would have to be different. Sure, whatever you want, Sol replied. But Lunafreya is still kind of a mouthful. Then, please call me Luna. When she said it aloud, that familiar young face floated once more to mind. Lunafreya. Her name had been too long for him then as well. He'd stumbled over it, until finally they both settled on his simply calling her Luna. Okay, Luna it is. Then you quit calling me Miss. Just Sol is fine. Agreed, Lunafreya responded. Thank you, Sol. So, what do you have planned once you get to Insomnia? I will fight. I will challenge Arden. Arden? Don't tell me you're talking about Arden Azunia, Sol said, one eyebrow raised. When Lunafreya nodded in response, Sol first stared blankly. After the initial moment of shock, her words were incredulous and mixed with laughter. You're gonna take down Arden. That's a joke if I've ever heard one. Lunafreya simply regarded Sol in silence. She had no delusions that Arden would be an easy opponent to fell. But if she did not fight, if she did not stop Arden, the darkness shrouded in their star would ever remain. After a moment, Sol registered her expression and stopped laughing. Whoa, you're serious, aren't you? She seemed to hesitate, then mumbled to herself, Gotta be kidding me. But Lunafreya was most decidedly not kidding. The sentiment seemed to convey itself, and Sol's words, accompanied with a small sign, were, Fine, whatever. First we head to Lestalem, she continued. Your little trip to Insomnia comes after that. That good with you? Of course, Lunafreya nodded. She knew a sea crossing would be necessary to make it from the former empire to Insomnia. If Sol was taking her to Lestalem, it meant help and companionship through the crossing as well. It was far more than Lunafreya could have hoped for. She bowed her head and asked, It would be a great help. Thank you. I shall be most indebted. A look of distaste crossed Sol's face. Is something wrong? Lunafreya asked. Forget about it. Sol turned away, her eyes clearly contradicting her words. Lunafreya felt as though she said something wrong, but she had no idea what it might have been. Everything okay? My own thing seemed to refresh. And it was like, welcome to the chat room. Wait, good? Okay. Usually just when I see welcome to the chat room, I'm like, oh God, did I go out? I found one. This is one of them, yes? Luna held a can aloft, seeming quite pleased with herself. The two had driven back to the spot where the Oracle had thrown out the extra weight in their panicked flight from the Death Gaze. On the road, food was precious. They really couldn't afford to leave it. Along the way, Sol had also given Luna a chance to try driving the bike. It wasn't the kind of thing someone could pick up in a day or two, but they had a long trip ahead. There would be plenty of time for Luna to learn, and it'd be a lot easier on both of them once switching off became a viable option. Sol was able to identify the stretch of road where the bag had been lost. What proved to be the really painstaking work was tracking down the cans themselves, which had rolled off in all directions. Luna labored without a single word of complaint. She probably felt responsible, which she pretty much was, since she'd been the one to fling the bag out of the sidecar in the first place. So Luna hunted in concentrated silence, save for her triumphant outbursts for each find. Here's another, she exclaimed. She was quick. In the time it took Sol to find one can, Luna would pick up 3 or 4. Geez, you're good at finding things, Sol had begun to say, but she clamped her mouth shut. What was that? The Oracle asked. Nothing. Forget about it. As the words formed, it had occurred to Sol just exactly what would make someone, or something, so quick to locating the cans. Visual acuity in low light conditions. In other words, seeing well at night. Just the kind of thing demons were good at. When they had the encounter with the Death Gaze, Luned seemed to be pulling or absorbing some kind of energy from the monster, and the particles that rose off her open wound, for the brief span of time it had been open at all, were just like those of a demon. And now, here was another demon-like skill, hunting things in the dark. It fit right in with the other odd feats that the Oracle was apparently capable of. But it didn't seem right to jump to the conclusion that Luna was an enemy just because she had powers in common with the demons. Sol had made sure to visibly lower her guard a few times the previous evening to see if her new companion might go for a surprise attack. She'd seen no indication or desire to try. And of course, to top it all off, there was the woman's ludicrous claim that she intended to face off against Arden Izunia himself. How were you supposed to react to something like that? Sol was still wrestling with the question as their search for the wayward cans wrapped up. After that, they hopped back on the bike, and when they'd ridden for about an hour, they were met with bits of white falling gracefully from the sky. Not a cloud in sight, but we've got a flurry, Sol observed. It was said to happen around here, in this little swath of land sandwiched between the desert and the mountains locked in eternal winter, but only at this particular time of year, when the temperatures were low and the air was dry. Strong wind lifted snow from the peaks and carried it to fall like a winter flurry over the land below, creating the bizarre sight of snow falling from a clear sky. I guess it's probably nothing to you, being from Tenebrae and all. I have known of it, yes, but this is my first time seeing it with my own eyes, Luna responded. It was described to me as resembling a cascade of white blossoms dancing through the sky. Against a sky like this, I'd say it's more like a swarm of insects. But how did it look to Luna's eyes? With her vision, perhaps snowflakes against a dark sky didn't look so bad. It occurred to Sol that everything she saw might look quite different to her companion. They might stare in the same direction and see two very different things. I wonder if I might ask you a question, Luna ventured hesitantly. Shoot. The way to Insomnia, no, the way to Lestalem. How many days' travel is it? Hate to say it, but I can't really give you a precise number. A vast expanse of sea stretched between the former lands of Niflheim and Lucis, where Lestalem was located. To get across, they'd need either a dropshift or a watercraft of some sort. But dropships were reserved for patrols and reconnaissance. Other uses weren't permitted. As far as ships capable of traversing open water, well, there were never enough hands available to keep the things in proper shape. And without many seaworthy vessels, it was likely they'd make it to the port only to find it empty and have to wait. From what I hear, this area used to be about 2 days from the port, but we're making the trip hunting demons along the way, so let's say 4 or 5. Problem is, after we get there, we may be waiting for a while before there's a ship that can take us. And I suppose even once we're across, it will take several more days. More than that, the City of Light itself is the only place that's safe. Demons lurk everywhere, so it's slow going. Yes, I suppose that makes sense, Luna replied, in a voice so small Sol thought it might get carried off by the wind. They'd had to deal with 3 demon encounters already, just to get to the site where they lost the cans. They narrowly managed to avoid 2 other packs by spotting the demons before they themselves were spotted and speeding away on the bike. 3 or 4 hours had gone by since they left Whale, but it certainly didn't feel like they'd managed to cover much ground. And demons aren't the only things that'll slow us down. We gotta make time to rest, too. Sol gently pressed on the brakes. Luna looked over it with astonishment. She seemed to want to protest that she could go farther. She wasn't yet tired. Not for us, Sol explained. For Regina. Sol patted one handlebar as she said it. The engine had been pretty hot for a while now. It was well past time to let it rest. The bike was running again, but it had been a quick fix. She'd had to make do with whatever parts she could, and Cindy, too, had made a point of telling her not to push the vehicle very hard. Regina? Luna asked. It wasn't until Luna chirped the name back that Sol realized what she'd done. Ugh, she hadn't meant to reveal that. Sol had met Regina during one of her early missions. She'd been busy helping beat back demons, and bam, there it was. An old Niflheim-built motorcycle just abandoned there on the side of the road. It was love at first sight. Sol knew she had to ride it, and she begged Cindy to restore the machine to working condition. Sid shook his head as he muttered about it being the kind of thing a do-nothing bum would ride, but he'd help Cindy fix it up, and no sooner was it running than Sol was riding and thinking up the name she'd christened her new partner with. What, you got a problem with my bike's name? She glared at Luna. Not at all, the Oracle responded. Not that any other answer would have mattered. Rider and bike were inseparable now. Sol wasn't going to let anyone laugh at the fact that she'd named her bike, or at the name itself. No travel faster than the slowest member of the group, Sol said. That's an ironclad rule among the hunters. So, obviously a little bit of parallel to the regalia there. Literally, a vehicle being named Queen. But it's a beaten up old bike. Since departing Whale, they'd stuck exclusively to one particular route that ran parallel to a railway track. It was a fairly narrow road, offering much less space than the major thoroughfares, and at least for the portion they'd traveled thus far, it was poorly maintained. Lunafreya had assumed Sol chose the road to avoid encounters with demons, but now she wasn't so sure. They'd run into plenty so far. Why, then, travel along such a tedious route? It wasn't until the end of the first day that she finally understood. Stations and signal cabins had been built along the track at regular intervals, so following the track meant that they'd never want for a relatively safe place to spend the night. Along this route, they'd always have a roof under which to sleep, and water lines servicing the buildings would enable them to drink and wash. According to Sol, only major stations were likely to see any upkeep and use as proper outposts, but even so, a tiny unnamed signal cabin would serve well enough for one night's stay. In the control room they were currently occupying, they found some tableware and folded blankets tucked away opposite the levers for the rail switches. There was even a small kerosene heater. A fine layer of dust coated everything, but aside from that, it was all in good enough condition to use. Sol lit the heater, filling the tiny building with warmth and the reek of kerosene. Lunafreya, suddenly overcome with fatigue, realized that if she sat down, she might not stand back up. Better to take care of everything that needed to get done before resting. "Shall I heat some water?" she asked. Sol grunted in response, and Lunafreya began combing the contents atop a set of small shelves. She found a small pot in which to heat water, as well as utensils for the night's canned meal. Then her eyes happened to fall upon a teapot hiding at the back of one shelf. A teapot, she thought. What an unusual find. If there was a teapot, then perhaps... Lunafreya's hands and eyes continued to search, eventually coming to rest upon a familiar rectangular metal shape. Loose-leaf tea. A bit of rust had begun to form on the outside of the tin, but when she popped off the top to check the contents, the tea itself seemed dry enough. She turned back to face Sol at the heater and asked, "Would you mind if I put on some tea?" "Tea?" Sol seemed surprised. "I found it on one of the shelves." "Sure, if you want." It would be her first cup of tea in what felt like ages. Her heart leapt, and she offered silent thanks to whatever tea-loving engineer it was who had been stationed here in the past. Waiting for the pot to boil was an agonizing exercise in patience. When the water was finally ready, Lunafreya poured a small amount into the teapot to let it warm. She dumped that water out, put in a few spoonfuls of the curled black leaves, then poured the hot water over them, this time filling the pot. Normally, she'd have used a bit of water to warm the teacups as well, but she decided it was better to place a limit on luxury. They boiled only so much water. Warming the teapot alone would have to do. She looked inside the pot once more to check that the leaves had properly unfurled in their scalding bath. Then, when the brew was ready, she poured it into the cups. The unmistakable scent of rich black tea filled the room. "Well, give it a try," Lunafreya said, and Sol lifted the cup to her lips. The younger woman's brow furrowed slightly. "Kinda bitter," she said. "Forgive me, I couldn't find any sugar." Sol was right. The tea was rather strong, probably a blend meant to go with milk. Of course, to Lunafreya, even the bitterness of tea was a cherished taste. "But it smells nice," Sol added. Brings back memories or whatever." Yes, it did bring back memories. This was a scent that reminded one of a world over which the sun still shone. For a while, the two continued drinking in silence. It was a comfortable quiet, falling pleasantly in the small space. When the cups were empty and Lunafreya began to pour another serving, Sol suddenly spoke up. "Where'd you learn that stuff?" "How to brew tea?" No, the way you fight with that thing. I can tell you're not a complete beginner." Sol pointed to the polearm resting against one wall. Lunafreya had found it among the items stored at Whale and decided to allow herself to make use of it, fully intending to return it at the adventure's conclusion. It had an unusually stout shaft, probably designed as such for the sturdiness required by the forces as mobile as the hunters, but she'd quickly grown accustomed to it. They'd run into enough demons in the course of the day to make sure of that. "It was part of my training. All who serve as oracle must be able to wield the trident." The oracles of old had at times been asked to help quell or drive off demons, and in fact, her physical training had extended beyond the use of weapons alone. She'd also been expected to build strength in her arms and legs. She'd not enjoyed it at the time, but afterwards she was grateful. It had been crucial preparation for her role in aiding the true king. The training had imparted both physical stamina and an ability to defend herself. She'd needed both while rousing the unruly gods and facing them on her own. She had a duty to fulfill and could not afford to collapse from fatigue. Still, she had not expected those skills to come in handy now, long after the fact. Practice with a weapon enabled her to battle small demons physically, without relying on the mysterious power of the first day. Lunafreya did not doubt the Draconian's gift, but each time she used it, a faint sense of dread accompanied the use. It became all too apparent that the essence of demons was being drawn into her body. Moreover, she'd come to understand something else. Demons weren't really demons at all. They did not exist as their own separate class of beasts or monsters. Rather, they were host to other organisms within them, enthralled to the strange black miasma. Other creatures were made into demons. It seemed most likely that the underlying cause was some sort of parasite, a scourge. When Lunafreya used her power to pull the source of the disease into her own body, the demon she faced would return to its former self. Yet because of weakness due to prolonged infestation, or perhaps because of the infestation had begun in a corpse rather than a living creature, the creature's restored form lasted but for a moment. Purged of its infection, it would quickly turn into a cloud of dust and disperse. The source of the illness, however, did not disperse. It remained lodged in Lunafreya's body, and she eliminated more and more of the demons. And as she eliminated more and more of the demons, she became home to greater and greater quantities of the tiny parasite. It left her with a looming concern. What would happen to her own body over time? She wasn't able to get by without using the power whatsoever. Only the smallest of demons could be vanquished with her spear and physical strength alone. For the ones that moved swiftly or possessed a stature exceeding her own, she had to rely on the power. It had seemed to take everything she and Sol had to defeat the demon of the day before, with its shape so evocative of a god of death. If they ever had to deal with an opponent stronger than that... What I think it means? Lunafreya had been so lost in thought she missed most of the question. Flustered, she said to Sol, I beg your pardon. Could you repeat that? Your training. I was asking what else you had to do besides learn how to fight. Lunafreya thought back to the training ground. Ralmuel, she realized, was not so far from where they were now. It, too, was located somewhere on this narrow stretch of land lying between Esulio and Sucarpe. In the broadest sense, Lunafreya responded, it was a regimen for me to strengthen my body and mind. To increase my physical strength, I ran and swam. To sharpen my focus, I spent many hours in meditation. In addition to that, I was introduced to the relics of the oracles of the past, that I might know them more intimately. And then there were the chants and the dances. Huh, sounds kind of fun, Sol smirked. I suppose at times I rather did enjoy myself. Lunafreya had never shunned physical activity. Song, too, gave her joy. When she gave herself to the lyrics, bringing melody into the world with all she had, it always managed to drive the clouds of worry from her mind. Of course, not all training had been fun. It was almost always rigorous, designed to bring her to the verge of breaking. It was the surest way to sharpen her mind and build the endurance she would need. Sorry, I keep reading ahead a little bit. Slow down. There were also periods of fasting. Those were rather difficult to endure. And the isolation for days at a time. Ugh, that part sounds awful. I could never make it through that. Training is not training unless it requires you to endure. Sol scrunched up her face and made another disgusted sound. Lunafreya couldn't help but laugh at her companion's obvious distaste. So, why'd you go through all of it in the first place? Like, what's the purpose of the training? The answer seemed so obvious, Lunafreya wondered why anyone would ask. But the most basic question sometimes had a way of getting at the heart of a matter and opening a path to a deeper understanding. Sol's question gave her pause, and she considered how to best put her thoughts into words. Why, to prepare me to fulfill my duties as Oracle, of course. And what are your duties as Oracle? To heed the words of the gods and aid the king. And that makes you happy? It is not a question of happiness. Sol's next question was even more bewildering. Well then, is the compensation good? Lunafreya stared at Sol blankly. You know, compensation. Pay. They must pay you pretty well for all that work, right? The Oracle's duties are a service to the people. So you work for free? Are you kidding me? I mean, I guess maybe if it was something you enjoyed. That I get. But there's nothing fun about having to perform some public service. If you're not getting paid for it, why even bother? That is someone who was raised by a Renea. How could Lunafreya explain that it was not a question of choice? The Oracle's duties were mandated by the gods, and they must be carried out. It had always been that way, since long, long ago. Whatever, Sol said. Guess it's just beyond me. Lunafreya, for her part, found Sol's questions equally incomprehensible. Compensation? For her labors as oracle? It seemed absurd. The conversation ended without resolution, and they sat drinking the remainder of the tea in uneasy silence. After their usual dinner of 1 can each, they washed their own cups and utensils and set about their own tasks. Or rather, Sol began cleaning and checking her guns, while Lunafreya found herself with nothing in particular to do. It was still too early to sleep. Suddenly, she remembered the notebook from the day before. She'd forgotten to return it after Umbra's refusal. It wasn't until after they departed Whale that she realized the notebook was still among her belongings. As long as she had it, it seemed just as well to put it to use in keeping a record on the day's events. And though the signal cabin didn't boast nearly as many supplies as the outpost at Whale, it took only a quick look around the control room to find a pen. Her scrawled message from before read, "I'm safe." Farther down the page, she noted her location. Railway signal cabin. And below that, she began her entry. Dearest Noctis, I am currently on a journey across the former lands of Niflheim, riding in the sidecar of a motorcycle driven by a hunter named Sol. My days are filled with new experiences, and though the difference in age between Sol and me is not so great, I found our minds working quite in different ways. Already her companionship has yielded numerous surprises. Okay, so Mon's telling me to call it here. Because, yeah, I keep stumbling over myself like an idiot. Oh, geez. Yeah, I keep glancing up to make sure everything's okay. Let's see. I'm gonna... Hang on. Calling it here. There's a bigger break coming up pretty soon, and there's actually something that... And there's a good... It's a good, like, cliffhanger. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to slow myself down a little bit more. I'm sorry I keep skipping and tripping over my words. But there's a good cliffhanger to leave off at, and a big break. Not just like, for anyone reading along, they have little line breaks. This is actually like a big old section break instead of a line break. So I am going to move to the big old break, and I'm just going to slow my fucking roll a little bit more. It's a little bit of a whiplash changing from Luna to Sol. But I promise this is going to end on a good cliffhanger, and I just need to slow my fucking roll, and then I'm going to stop like my mod advises. The following morning, before Luna woke, Sol slipped out of the control room for a moment alone. The rusty old door gave a harsh creak, but fortunately Luna didn't stir in the slightest. Come to think of it, the Oracle had slept like a log the previous day, too. Maybe the travel wore her out. Or maybe she just wasn't a morning person. In any case, a bit of noise was apparently not enough to wake her. Not that Sol was complaining. She took out her smartphone and flicked through her contacts. It didn't bug her so much to speak to Cindy in front of Luna, but conversations with family were a different matter. Better safe than accidentally overheard. She should have called home the previous day, but it was a little late to feel guilty about it. The whole day she'd been fuming, convinced that if a certain someone was worried, it was their responsibility to call and make sure everything was all right. It was the logic of a petulant child, an unfortunate tendency of hers, one that she knew undermined her own constant demands to be treated more like an adult. It only made things worse that she'd let herself get separated from her comrades. She'd been so certain she could mop up that pack of demons on her own, and so intent on proving herself a proper hunter in her own right. At any rate, a couple of nights' sleep had brought things into perspective. It was on her to apologize. She was in for a scolding, but she'd stand up and take it like a woman. Sol tapped the contact and waited, but the call didn't go through. Their phone was probably switched off. A letdown, but not out of the ordinary. The person Sol was trying to reach might be in the middle of planning an operation, or maybe piloting the dropship. Signal interference was a legitimate risk and a smart one to eliminate in any situation that might require quickly issued commands. It was a funny little coincidence how Lucian smartphones and communication equipment aboard Imperial dropships tended to get in each other's way. Well, guess that's not happening, she muttered and turned to go back inside. Then she remembered there was someone else who deserved an apology. She looked back at her phone and brought up the contact. This call would definitely involve an angry earful, probably starting the second the call went through. The thought made her hesitate a moment before dialing. A bunch of angry shouting, first trying to ascertain whether she was safe, then demanding to know her current location. The fact that the yelling was born out of worry rather than real anger made it harder to bear, but she bit her lip and dialed. When the call connected, she was met with a different, much calmer voice. "Well, if it isn't the little lady. Would you please stop calling me that?" Wedge's insistence on Lady S was bad enough, but the way that Biggs addressed her was absolutely humiliating. Lately, she'd finally managed to convince them to refer to her as Sol, but every once in a while, for who knew what reason, they'd pull out those terribly embarrassing nicknames. "Look," Sol continued, "I just called to say I'm sorry to make you worry. You, already hear about it from Cindy? Called us yesterday." Honestly, Sol didn't even need to ask. The other day, she'd been so anxious to dump the two smothering babysitters that she'd lied to them. She told Biggs and Wedge that the rendezvous time with the hunters was an hour later than it actually was. After she'd given them the slip, they'd probably panicked and called everybody and anybody they could think of, desperate for any leads on where Sol might have been headed. Cindy was probably the first person they'd dialed, which meant that after yesterday's chat about the bike, Cindy had undoubtedly passed on the news to Biggs and Wedge. "And what about Mom?" Sol asked. "Lady A's, There was the briefest pause, then, "She's busy planning an op, as it were." "At the ruins?" "That's right. She's just gone, as a matter of fact, on her way to reinforce the advance team." Biggs's choice of words seemed to imply that the initial survey team had run into trouble. Surveys in former Imperial territory, and especially excavations of ancient ruins, were a double-edged sword. They often yielded desperately needed resources, but danger was ever at the team's backs. Biggs continued, "But don't you worry. It'll all be fine. Wedge and I will rendezvous with her shortly." "I want to go too." The situation bothered Sol. The fact that the advance team had called for assistance at all suggested something big had happened, and there had been that slight hesitation before Biggs answered her question. "Where are you now?" Biggs asked. "Just outside Whale, at the nearest signal station." "Puts you a day or two out from Nom, yeah? Head over and sit tight. Sure we'll have it all sorted out after you arrive." Nom, the largest outpost in former Imperial territory. The station house there was old, but it was a big, solid structure, and there were always a few hunters posted there. It was close to the ruins, too. "If I start out now, I can make it to Nom tonight. Wait for me to..." "Tonight? Maybe if you don't come across a single demon on the way, but chance be a fine thing, eh? Don't push it." "But..." Biggs cut her off. "We'll be shoving off at any moment. Won't have time to wait for you, so just take it slow." The last statement suggested precisely what Sol didn't want to hear. Biggs and Wedge were probably already close to Nom. If Sol stamped her feet and Biggs relented, she'd only end up delaying the rescue operation. Sol mumbled sour agreement into the phone, to which Biggs replied, "There's a good girl. You take your time and play it safe, all right? If something happens to our little lady, we're the ones who have to answer to Lady A." "I told you to quit calling me that!" Sol yelled into the phone, petulant child once more, and cut the call. The way their conversation had ended was par for the course, except this time the routine didn't do anything to help Sol calm down. She had a feeling they needed to hurry to Nom. It was time to wake up Luna and hit the road. Perhaps because they occurred when she was on the cusp of waking, the dreams Lunafreya saw at dawn were always brief. The images in her mind were clear and crisp, but they lingered for only a moment. So she'd believed the same would be true of this dream. Gentiana stood before her now, but since she surely would be gone soon, Lunafreya's words spilled out in frenetic fashion. "Gentiana, how I've been longing to see you. I would have liked it to be in the waking world, as with Umbra, but I'm delighted you're here now, even if only in dreams." Lunafreya had been waiting eagerly for this reunion. There were so many things she wanted to say, and she needed to get them out before the dream ended. "Tell me, did you know from the beginning that the ring would take Noctis's life? Yes, I suppose you must have, but you kept silent for my sake. You did not wish to see me tormented by worry or anguish." Gentiana smiled fondly. Lunafreya drew closer, only to find she was unable to reach out to the messenger. "Of course I can't," she told herself. "This is a dream. That is why," she continued, "I've decided to confront Arden. If I fight, I can drive away the darkness. The star will be safe, and Noctis will not have to use the ring. It is my new calling, bestowed upon me by the Draconian. That he asked me must mean I am capable if I try." Lunafreya paused, then added, "But still, I must confess I am frightened. I know I should not fear, but I find this power entrusted to me quite unnerving. What if my humanity should slip away?" After another pause, Lunafreya realized something was amiss. She had carried on the entire conversation by herself. Gentiana had not spoken a word. At first, Lunafreya had assumed it was because she was in a dream, but now she was not so certain. As she watched, Gentiana's lips moved, ever so slightly. "Gentiana," she asked, "is something wrong?" Before, the messenger had been smiling. Now she seemed to be in pain. Her features were twisted with effort, as if she were desperately trying to relay something. "What is it? Do you have a message for me?" "The Blade Keeper," she seemed to mouth. But Lunafreya was not certain. Again, she tried to draw near, peering closely at the messenger's face. Just then, several towering blades flew down before her eyes, forming a wall between Lunafreya and the messenger. "Gentiana!" she shouted with all her might, but all went black and silent. Lunafreya wasn't sure which came first, the end of the dream or the opening of her eyes onto darkness as she returned to the waking world. When her mind was focused once again, she found herself in the cramped control room of the tiny signal cabin. She pulled her blanket more tightly around her body and shivered. "What a peculiar dream," she said to herself. She had long grown used to accepting the dreams for what they were. She could no better govern her dreams than her fate. Still, she had to wonder about her earlier visitation from the Blade Keeper. She hadn't thought to dismiss that first encounter as a mere dream. The difference, she decided, was one of intimacy. The Draconian was not a being well known to her, but Gentiana she'd come to know more closely than perhaps anyone else in the world. That was why the encounter had felt unnatural, and she'd been able to sense something was amiss. So, perhaps it was not a dream. What if Gentiana had visited to relay some message, as the Draconian had before? Something might be preventing her from sharing that message. Lunafreya tried to think. What could have happened to Gentiana? But just then, Sol interrupted her thoughts. "Luna!" The door of the control room flew open with a bang. "Get yourself ready and step on it. We're leaving." "Has something happened?" Lunafreya asked. She rose and began to fold the blanket in haste, watching Sol's expression as she did so. The other woman appeared uncharacteristically anxious. "It's nothing. Just hurry, okay?" Lunafreya had yet to spend much time with Sol, but she had learned one thing about her companion. She had an occasional tendency to lie, and when she did so poorly. I at least wanted to get to Gentiana. So, looks like Bahamut's being a dick. And I think this also answers the question of what happened. Like, where was Gentiana when Luna died? Being a little bitch, drinking out of cups. If you guys haven't seen that video, for the love of God, Google it. But that, because like that was something I thought of, and it's something I've seen online since, because I was like, I wonder, and I Googled it. But like, that's the best thing I can think of, is that Gentiana did want to help. She didn't want Luna to die, but she was stopped by Bahamut himself, because Bahamut wasn't going to let fate be intervened, essentially, with. As long as it, like, Luna's death was a necessary catalyst for Arden to be defeated. I think in episode Ignis, the reason Bahamut didn't stop, it's been confirmed in a thing with the devs that the reason that they only took Ignis's sight is because they needed Ignis alive, because they realized his worth to Noctis. So in the AU, where everybody but Luna lives, Arden is still defeated, so Bahamut's final plan is like, whatever, you know? Like, it doesn't matter, because Arden's defeated, but at this point, Arden is too powerful for Bahamut, and it's making Bahamut start to worry. So Luna's death was a catalyst that needed to happen for Noctis. And now that it's kind of backfired, or now that Arden is that fucking pissed, Bahamut needs Luna now. So, yeah, but he doesn't want Gentiana telling her something. But I think it's safe to assume that Bahamut has intervened on more than one occasion, especially when it comes to Luna. And I will say this enforces my mod's theory that the gods did have a hierarchy. I thought that they were all even, relatively. She thought Bahamut was still kind of, not like the king of them, but still the most powerful of them. And we learned in here, through my tripping over myself, for which I apologize, that Bahamut is essentially the cosmos, and what is humanity to the cosmos? Whereas the other 5 were actual elements, and they had a more hands-on experience. So, I apologize for tripping all over myself. I was glancing up to make sure things were going okay, because I was having some technical difficulties as well. So I kept losing my place. And I was glancing up, making sure that was okay, and then I have a tendency to... I read really, really, really quickly, like, in my head, and I try to glance ahead for cues on how to read. Like, I misread Soul talking to Cindy on the phone. And I read it as her calling out to somebody in the outpost instead, because I didn't glance ahead to see that she was on the phone. So that's why I do that. I look for cues on how to read, but it can mix me up sometimes. Or I can be reading one line, but my eye will catch something a line down, and I'll either just like skip a line, or I'll start messing up my words, and that's when you hear me go bleh, 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 bleh. I'm not a perfect reader by any means. I apologize. This one was a little choppy. I'm excited to be reading episode Lunafreya. I'm like stoked to be reading episode Lunafreya, to be perfectly honest. So part of that is just excitement, because I love the adventures of Luna and Soul. And when I came back to reading Dawn of the Future, where I started was at Luna's death, because I had read episode Arden and episode Aranea, and then I had left Dawn of the Future for like alone for months, and then I came back to it. Like I remember episode Arden very, very well, and then I was like, I remember episode Aranea pretty decently. And then I started episode Luna, and I started off with Luna's death, and I was like, I hate this. I was trying not to smile when I saw chat's reaction, because I was like, oh, this is gonna get him. And yeah, chat, you guys did not disappoint. Freaking the fuck out. Because that was how I felt. I was like, no, no, no. Can we not relive Luna's death scene, please? I hated that, and I hate you. Look, don't blame me. Blame Tabata. I'm wielding my book like a shield. Right now. I'm like shielding myself from the screen. Look. It's really upsetting, and I hate it. I tried to give it the gravity it was due, but I haven't seen that scene since I played through it. Because guess what? I don't like watching that scene because it makes me cry. So, I hope I did the gravity of that. Oh, your little Lottle. Oh. He's not drinking out of cups, being a bitch. So yeah, Luna also didn't know that Noctis was supposed to die. And she wouldn't have survived the ritual of the Tide Mother either. So that's interesting as to how Noctis would have forged a covenant. I mean, he managed to form one with Bahamut on his own, I guess, from the crystal. But, yeah, Luna had said that she wasn't even going to survive awakening Leviathan. Like, she was that weak from the covenants. In hindsight, kind of makes everything Ravis did incredibly fucking justified. Like, after reading this and then going back through the game with, like, Ravis kind of goggles on, like, trying to see things from Ravis's point of view, I blame him less and less for being an asshole. He's an asshole. But, yeah. I mean, like, yeah, he was like, I want to invade Insomnia. And he was there at the ceremony and he put on the ring, but, like, I do think he did it for Luna. So she would stop. I don't think he intended Regis to get killed. It was kind of a bonus for him, but, like, I don't think he was there out of vengeance for Regis. I think he was there to turn it on the Empire. And I don't know what about Ravis saved his life. But, like, the fact that they only took his arm instead of killing him, the old kings, I don't know what it was they saw in Ravis that they were like, all right, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to take your arm. And I'm like, now I'm kind of, wondering, like, what about you, Ravis? Like, because, like, Ravis's actions seem so fucking justified now, knowing that Luna was going to die summoning Leviathan. She knew she wasn't going to make it to her fucking wedding day. That was all she had wanted in game. And then at the point we find her in game, it's too late for her to have even gotten married. So she was never even able to put on the damn dress, and she knew she wouldn't have been able to. This upsets me greatly. The more I talk about it, I'm very upset. Ravis is still an asshole, but, like, damn, his actions are seeming more and more justified. Fuck, dude. 15 is not... EOS is not a nice world. 15 isn't a nice game. But I love it. We love it all the same, don't we, chat? As we throw books across the room and yeet our PS4s and cry. It's up there with Evilise and cruelty. It really is. For those of you, I'm veering off a little bit off topic, but I mean, I think this is important discussion for the video, even though it's not part of the reading. Evilise is the world of Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy 12. Also, if you've played Vagrant Story, it's a spin-off of Evilise, but Evilise is like the cruelest world that Square Enix has ever come up with. And that's also the only world where you can actually raise someone from the dead if you get to them quickly enough. Phoenix Downs are actually a resurrection instead of a KO. The joke being, har har, you know, like, why didn't I had 99 Phoenix Downs? Why didn't I just use it on Aerith? Har 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 har. Because Phoenix Downs are like smelling salts. Like, I had that theory forever, but it's been pretty much confirmed. And, especially with the 7 remake and 15 and everything, it's been pretty much confirmed. But Evilise, when people die, you can bring them back to life if you get to them quickly enough. In Tactics, it's within 3 turns, which seems gracious, but it's not. You really don't have a lot of time. And I can't remember 12. But, yeah, Evilise is like the cruelest world that they've come up with. I would need to play Type 0 all the way through to know where Type 0 ranks on it, because Type 0 is a nasty-ass world, too, because if you die, people forget about you. And that's a terrifying thought, too, but, like, so I think Type 0 is up there, too, but that's another Tabata world, so, you know. Eos and Type 0's world, I would probably say is a safe guess, and then Evilise are, like, the cruelest worlds. Evilise is by far the meanest, but Eos is, it was all leading up to this because of the will of Bahamut. It's a world with bot of peace instead of vice versa. Yeah. And yeah, Evilise, you have to have a 98% chance to be Evilise, you have a 98% chance to be born into a bloody war. Yeah, you do. It is a nasty, nasty, nasty place. Final Fantasy Tactics is awesome, though. The original. So good. Oh, good. My upload speed is starting to peter, so that's a sign I should finish as well. So we will continue the adventures of Luna and Sol the next time. Sorry about the technical difficulties on my end as well. Sorry about the stumbling. And I'll just upload these on the same day. It'll be a double upload on the YouTubes. So, yeah. So thank you guys so much for stopping by. And for those of you on YouTube, thank you for getting through this episode while stumbling. With me stumbling. I just get excited and I start to read really fast and then I trip over everything and I have to make myself slow down. And I just didn't make myself slow down. I kept careening. We should be able to finish episode Lunafreya in the next one. So, and then we'll be on to tackling episode Noctis. Yes. So, thank you guys so much, and I will see you next time. Take it easy.